So my name is Matti Leppälä. I'm the Secretary General of PensionsEurope, and I'm taking over as the host of this conference. Liam Kennedy kindly took care of this part of the conference until now. He had to leave for his flight. The topic of the conference, how to protect pensions in the time of turmoil. Pension funds have very long liabilities and they need to be protected. They can use bonds, but the market is limited and the duration of the bonds is also a challenge for longevity risks and other types of risks that need to be covered. So derivatives are an important part of good risk management for interest rate risks, for other types of risks. But derivatives also have risks that need to be managed, and their central clearing of derivatives provides protection for both buyers and sellers of derivatives. We have important developments in the derivatives markets and clearing of derivatives in Europe, and it's my great pleasure to welcome as the next keynote speaker Mr. Matthias Graulich, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of Eurex, to talk about derivatives and clearing way forward.
Thank you very much, Matti, for the kind introduction, and also a warm welcome from my side. The room got a bit more empty. It's getting late afternoon, but it's a pleasure really to be here today and speaking a bit about the challenges the pension fund industry in Europe is facing, and I will share today some perspectives from a market infrastructure perspective. Just to introduce a bit Eurex. I mean, if someone from ABP speaks, you exactly know who is speaking and what they are doing. Eurex is one of the largest derivatives and repo marketplaces in the world. We are the home of some of the largest derivatives contracts you use to manage your risks, like the Euro Stoxx future or a Bund future. We also have repo products and we clear swaps. We operate one of the largest clearing houses globally here in Frankfurt, and all elements we deal with is all about risk management. So the products we do are risk management products, and CCP at its heart are risk management, has a proper risk management function. So the topic for today is protect pensions in market of turmoil, and we have heard in the course of this morning a number of aspects how to look at this, and from my perspective I would like to look at it from two aspects, to link the pension protection on the one hand with the derivatives and clearing world on the other hand. And these two elements are, first of all, the resilience of the overall financial market ecosystem, and second, managing pension funds' credit and liquidity risks. And in this context, let me start looking a bit back, because to understand the role of a CCP, I think we need to go back into history a bit, and I'm going all the way back to the great financial crisis 2008, where many of you probably felt a lot of pain by generating a lot of losses, which have been hammered returns quite significantly. And in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, there was a range of new rules coming to the industry, the financial industry, in particular the banking industry, with a focus to increase the resilience of the overall ecosystem and in the banking system particularly, and in order to avoid kind of these significant losses and spillover effects from the banking industry into the neighboring industries, and foremost or at the heart also to avoid using taxpayer money if something goes wrong in the system. I think from today's standpoint, I would say all these measurements have worked out well. The system has been stabilized and was really robust in the last 15 years since Lehman. But we have to acknowledge that until COVID, we had a market which was very calm. So we had no interest rates, we had no volatility, we had hardly any volatility in the market except for sporadic events. We had no inflation, very important. But this all changed with the breakout of COVID in 2020, and sometime later, early last year, the unacceptable aggression of Russia against Ukraine, and suddenly we are in a completely different world than we were pre-COVID. Suddenly, we have exploding inflation rates, we have increasing interest rates, markets are not sporadically volatile, but markets are volatile for a prolonged period of time, which brings along a lot of challenges, not only for pension funds, but for the financial industry as a whole. We also saw global supply chains breaking in this kind of wake in the, as a consequence of COVID. And I'm kind of emphasizing that element because these global supply chains are building on a thrust of stable and resilient global system. But what we for many, many years have taken as that is stable and we don't need to worry about some crisis somewhere, the global chains are working, the last 3 years have shown that this thrust is probably a bit too optimistic, and we need to consider potential costs of disruptions in the system, of instability of the overall system. And the costs which many people have incurred, in particular in the real economy, by these broken value chains are quite quite substantial. And I'm coming back to that point in the context why it matters also here for the financial industry and for the pension funds very much. So to conclude on this aspect, resilience and stability are very, very important aspects because if they are not working anymore, it can come along with very, very substantial costs to the real economy and to the financial economy and to pension funds and to the society overall. And this is in particular true for financial markets, who at the end are, I would say, the lifeblood of the real economy, and therefore the stability and resilience is of utmost importance. Now, all these events highlight that proper risk management is very, very important. And as I said at the beginning, derivatives are at its core risk management products, and you all use them in your daily management of your funds. Now, linking this product derivatives dimension with the resilience of the overall ecosystem together, if those products, these derivatives products, are managed outside the EU, so in a third country, the authorities within the EU in that instance have a serious issue, in particular when it comes to a crisis situation. Now, if it comes to a crisis situation as an EU authority, as an EU central bank, you want to have transparency on the size, the risk in those products, who holds those risks, and you want to have the possibility to make sure that the market infrastructure who manages those risks are doing that on proper risk management standards. And lastly, you want to make sure that if it is needed, you have the possibility to intervene, to inject capital, to inject liquidity in order to calm down the crisis and stabilize the system, which central banks very often do if these events come up. But the limitations are given. If these products sit outside your remit, then you have a hard time to intervene, and you are fully dependent on the cooperation and the goodwill of the authorities and the central banks in that third country. Now, if you think about it, and I'm talking about the conflict of interest between the UK and the European Union, is the first priority for the Bank of England and the FCA in such a crisis situation to care about the interest of the European Union and the euro? Probably not, for understandable reasons. That's why over the last couple of years, since Brexit, the concerns have increased that the autonomy of the European Union with regards generally to the financial market environment, but with regards to these products in particular, are not adequately addressed. And the ESMA and the European Commission have identified basically 3 products which are of systemically relevance to the EU, but today sitting to the vast majority outside their direct control. These products are euro-denominated interest rate swaps, euro-denominated credit default swaps, and Euribor futures, who are all sitting on market infrastructures outside the EU. Now, the European Commission and the authorities in general have called the market for a number of years now in a market-driven approach to rebalance this ecosystem, to bring more risk into the EU, to allow them to better monitor and manage those risks from an overall system and from a monetary policy perspective. But while there is some progress in this regard, it's obviously not sufficient from an EU authority perspective. Now, what happened in December 2022, the European Commission presented a legislative proposal which had a number of important elements. First, to structurally strengthen the clearing activities within the EU, so making the EU environment more attractive. This has a number of elements which are very important. But additionally, they implemented, or they suggest to implement a measure to address this substantial substantial stability concern they have with regards to those products. And the concept they have laid out in this EMIR 3.0 proposal is a requirement for EU market participants to do at least a portion of their business in those products within an EU-based market infrastructure, in addition to what they do in a UK-based market infrastructure. And this is called the active account requirement. Now, there is a lot of debate going on currently on this active account requirement, and most industry associations, including, I think, the Dutch Pension Fund Association yesterday morning, kind of are lobbying against this active account requirement. And I have to say, against the background of what the alternatives are, for me, this is a very targeted and proportionate approach. And I tell you why. The alternatives from an EU regulatory's perspective are, because all the calls to voluntarily achieve a stronger rebalancing of these products into the EU have obviously not worked out. So on the spectrum of the possibilities from an EU Commission's perspective, there was a location policy being discussed. I think that is something what really no one at the end wants, because this prescribes where you have to do your business. It has potential unintended consequences, it has cliff edge risks attached to it. So a lot of issues attached to it. There is an indirect way on how the EU Commission and ESMA can achieve that by not prolonging temporary equivalence, which is currently running until mid of 2025 for EU CCP. So if this temporary equivalence would not be prolonged, there would be no option to do this business from an EU market participant anymore in the UK, and you would have to use a European-based market infrastructure in Frankfurt or in Paris. Now, that's why I personally believe, and we as an organization believe, is that this active account requirement is a quite neat compromise, because on the one hand, it triggers more business moving into the EU, but on the other hand, it gives all the EU market participants the degrees of freedom and the flexibility to continue to use market infrastructures in the UK. And with that, we continue to have a competitive environment for different alternatives where you can do your business. We have pressure in this market to continue to innovate, which at the end is at your benefit. We have a risk diversification effect by not having a 90-10 or 95-5% distribution of the business, but perhaps to achieve a 50-50% of the distribution. And ultimately, if we achieved via this soft push from the active account, this rebalancing, the EU regulators would probably look completely different at the situation with regards to systemic risk sitting in the UK, but saying, okay, systemic risk has substantially been reduced, now we can keep the road to London open, and this is at the end what we want to achieve and what we are kind of lobbying and advocating for. And if I read the argumentation coming up why people don't want this active account, we don't want to be forced to do something somewhere, we want to have full degrees of freedom to decide where we want to do this business. This is an individual perspective, but it ignores that there is a bigger systemic risk discussion, which, if something goes wrong and the central bank has no possibility to intervene and help, these costs coming out of such a situation will then fall back onto the market participants, similar to what we have seen in the Lehman crisis. It will affect negatively pension funds and pensioners. And I think these costs are very, very hard to quantify, but at the end, they are probably a reality if it comes to that stage. And don't get me wrong, we are an advocate of free markets and choice. But what we have seen, and one of the key drivers we are in favor of this soft approach, is we have seen that a number of market participants onboarded on the Eurex side, and I know that the same is true for LCH and Paris for credit, onboarded with the CCPs in the EU. So we have 600 clients and clearing members onboarded. This covers probably 60% of the European client base eligible, but only half of them are running active accounts. The others, 300, just having dormant accounts. And if you speak to them, they say, oh, your service looks good, everything's great, but you know, and I even acknowledge that there are some benefits on the back end of it, with cross-product margining and lower funding costs due to collateral range and so on. But you know what, I have such a long list, and we have heard how many challenges you all have, of topics. This does not make it, based on this proposition, to the top of my list. If there would be some kind of impetus from Brussels to say you need to do it, then I think everyone is perfectly fine in doing it, because prices are the same, service is probably even better, and other considerations. And I personally believe if we get to this active account in a very soft way, we will activate 300 plus accounts, we will see a larger shift of business into the EU, which then, I'm absolutely convinced that ESMA and the EU Commission will take down their weapons and say, okay, we are fine, equivalence is being declared to UK CCPs, and you can use both CCPs for the foreseeable future. And I think that is something I would want to achieve together with the industry, because I think it's the best way to go down that route and avoid the risk that ultimately the EU Commission has no other option than declaring a mandate to clear in the EU or let the temporary equivalence lapse in 2025. Now let me turn to my second point, which I mentioned at the beginning, managing pension fund credit and liquidity risks. In addition to the kind of broader geopolitical trends we all heard about and read about daily and the associated risks, there's a challenge for the pension funds coming up in June this year, which is the clearing obligation for OTC derivatives. And just to state the obvious, the products which are these systemically relevant products from an euro perspective are a subset of the products which are now in scope of the clearing obligation, in all likelihood kicking in June. From my perspective, and I can applaud and congratulate the industry, I think the industry is really well prepared to cope with this new requirement. And I'm also very thankful that many of you supported us in developing solutions to address some of your challenges you're facing around cash variation margin in times of stress, but I'll come back to that in a second. Let me start with the counterparty risk element. And given that Lehman is so far 15 years ago, where people really suffered from having a direct relationship to Lehman and lost a lot of money, I have the feeling that this counterparty risk element is moving more and more into the background. But most recently, I think this topic has been pushed forward onto the agenda of all market participants again. So we saw the Silicon Valley Bank event, and I think even more important from a European perspective is the Credit Suisse incident, which I think people have really taken off their radar, that it is possible for a systemically relevant bank to get in trouble given all the rules they apply in the meantime on these banks. Now, I think collateralization is a very important aspect, which is, from a cleared perspective, but also from a non-cleared perspective, the new norm, and mitigates some of this counterparty risk you're facing. But what it doesn't take away is the aspect of contract continuity. So if your counterparty fails, you have some collateral backing up the risk in this contract, but you lose your risk management, you lose your swap, and suddenly, until you can replace that swap, you are 100% exposed to market risk, which in times of high volatility, markets going up and down, can lead to quite substantial losses. Now, we as central counterparties were exactly set up to manage this counterparty risk as neutral risk managers. And we also were set up, and it was mentioned this morning by Andreas Jobs, I don't know whether he is still here, this blank spot in the risk assessment in the context of interconnectedness. What are the implications on you if something happens in the system with a counterparty not directly connected to you? So what type of domino effects are in the system affecting you if something goes wrong, which then has implications on other market participants? This counterparty aspect on the CCP side applies in the first instance to direct clearing members, but with some limitations, it is also important for you as clients, as clearing members. So today, you are, in most instances, set up as clients of clearing members. And on the OTC derivative side, in particular, in so-called ISA models, in individually segregated accounts, this allows you the highest level of asset protection if it comes to your positions and your collateral if something with the clearing bank goes wrong. In an most extreme situation, the clearing bank goes in default. Now, this segregation structure gives you also a very high chance of porting your positions and your collateral to an alternative clearing member should your existing clearing member go into default. Why is that important? Because it ensures that you keep your risk management product alive, and if you could not port your positions and your collateral, we as a CCP would have to liquidate your positions, which means you are, until you place this contract, unhedged and exposed to market risk. Now, this is, for us, only the second best solution if you sit in such an ISA account, because what we would much more see is if you would be a direct member of the CCP, because then you would not face the credit risk of a clearing bank like Deutsche, Credit Suisse, or JP Morgan, but you would face the credit risk of a credit risk or of a risk manager like us as a CCP. And you would not have to worry about a default of some of the clearing brokers out there. We have developed innovative models in that context which allow you to become quasi a direct clearing member with some facilitation by the existing clearing brokers. But we believe that this is a solution which addresses to a much larger degree counterparty credit risk concerns from you, but also it helps to address the overarching systemic risk situation, because the more people are directly facing the CCP, the less knock-on effects and the less domino effects we will see if something goes wrong. Now, when I discussed this asset segregation topic with the market over the last couple of years, I always ask people, so swaps, you do the full asset segregation, but on futures, you go down a route where you do accept a net omnibus structure. So what does it mean? It means you sit in the same account as many other clients out there with the same clearing broker. So you accept fellow customer risk, you accept that your asset protected is not at all protected, and you accept that you have not a real chance to get ported if that clearing broker fails. And people were kind of shrugging their shoulders saying, it has always worked, why should we change it? And interestingly, so I came to Berlin directly from London, where I had client meetings the last 2 days, and I was really surprised. The Credit Suisse event suddenly has focused people's mind again on this question, and people said, oh, we were really shocked when we understood what the risks are we are currently taking by sitting commingled with many other clients in the same account. We realized, oh, our positions are not protected, our collateral is not protected. And so obviously this event of the Credit Suisse close to default, I would say, suddenly has raised again the awareness of how am I protected as a buy-side firm against the default of my large bank counterparts, which is something I would ask you just to take away and discuss in your firms, whether this is something you still feel comfortable with. And I think we are sitting here absolutely in the same boat. You want your assets to be protected. I want to have the highest level of certainty that I can find a new clearing home for you if something with your existing clearing provider goes wrong. Let me turn to my last aspect on the liquidity risk, just 2 minutes. The exemption you have been granted in the OTC clearing context for a number of years now was based predominantly on the question, do you have sufficient cash when you need it in a crisis situation, in a rates rising environment, to fund variation margin at a CCP, which is only possible in cash. And I'm really thankful that some of your largest kind of peers have helped us to develop the models, and we're acting as early adopter for those models. So it's a model which allows now pension funds to get access to the cleared repo market. Why is that so important? Because other than the bilateral repo markets, in all crisis situations where the liquidity in bilateral repo markets very quickly dried up and banks were not willing to give any balance sheet to clients, we saw an inflow in liquidity in the cleared repo markets. So the robustness of these cleared setups is much more robust in crisis situations when you probably need access to this liquidity. And again, I'm really glad that we had the help and the support from some of the largest players in the Netherlands in particular to spearhead this innovation, because innovation only at the end works if you have these people who are looking into the future and saying, oh, this makes sense and I'm the first one who is willing to support it. So I only can say that I'm looking forward to working together with more of you to address this liquidity challenge, which is probably more materializing now in the context of the clearing obligation, which is kicking in June. So let me conclude. The future, from my point, is generally more CCP clearing, and this CCP clearing in particular happening to a larger degree within the European Union. And I think with those two aspects, we make an important contribution to allowing you to protect pensions in turmoil. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthias. Very interesting, very complex topic. Some of it stemming from the great financial crisis, some issues coming from Brexit, some coming from very recent developments, some very political, some very much robust risk management. So many issues here. Any questions, comments from the audience? I think we have a very good audience for this topic presently here. Anybody wants to say anything about this issue at this point? Yes, Matthias. Just say, you'll get a microphone.
Thank you very much for the speech. Just a small clarification, I think, on our position. We would say, speaking on behalf of the Dutch Federation of Pension Funds, we would say we are in favor of having an active account, which is one that you can use, that is perhaps tested even, not just something that merely exists on paper. It is the fixed proportion that is concerning our members, because they do fear that they're not able to choose for the best market conditions. So just a small clarification on that part. Very interested to hear about cleared repo. I think there's a lot of interest. If we can solve the liquidity issue, you know, I think that's the big carrot with which you can draw in the Dutch pension fund sector. So, you know, I'm curious to hear more about that and whether that really is going to solve all the issues. If so, I think you can be quite hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the clarification. I misread the summary in IPE. No, that's good, and I think, well, I think it's important that people have an incentive to get active, And I think if people have this incentive, then business will automatically shift over time. I think it's really this question of getting started. Once you get started, then, I mean, things will progress. On the, perhaps one comment on the, I mean, cleared repo does not address any situation you can think of. And that's why I'm with you on the central bank aspect, which many of your colleagues know we have been very actively advocating with the central bank and still are very actively advocating with the central bank. So I'm still hopeful that at some point the central bank will join in this capacity perhaps the cleared repo market and really have the possibility to do this kind of backup or this backstop liquidity function if it was needed. I personally think it will never be needed, but to get people more comfortable, I think that is something which is, well, which you can do without any negative side implications if the central bank, to a larger degree, would join the cleared repo markets.
Yes, this is a topic that we've been advocating for a long time.
I know.
And of course saying that if and when the central banks in the end would step in, you know, why not do it in an orderly fashion rather than in a crisis situation. But then again, some may claim that this brings moral hazards to the picture. We also saw in Andreas Jobst's conclusions, one of the issues was, you know, how long will state always step in for all of this? How much is then left for the markets? But here we are talking about systemic risks, so it gets very serious very quickly.
Yeah, no, and I think, and I had the discussion with the central bank, and I said, if you join the cleared repo market, everyone in the industry has a stronger incentive to join the cleared repo market, and then the likelihood that you need to intervene with this step will go down because the market is positioned much more robust in this cleared environment than in today's environment. But this is a continuous discussion, and I hope that we finally will be successful in convincing them that this makes also from their perspective a lot of sense and that moral hazard does not play a significant role here.
Any other questions or comments on this? Or if not, thank you again, Matthias.
Thank you very much.